and next steps with Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW. I'm Elizabeth from Article 36, and which is a partner of ICAN based in the UK. And we have Kelly here from Nukewatch and the Affected Communities and Allies Working Group in the US. I'm going to be moderating today's event. The purpose of our event today is to highlight the ongoing harm being experienced by communities around the world today from the whole range of nuclear weapons activities, and both in states parties to the TPNW and also states not party, such as the US, where we are today for this conference, to be trying to end nuclear weapons, of course. And also we're going to look at what is the role of Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW, what its role can be in addressing some of these ongoing issues. So we'll hear from a range of views and a range of perspectives on these questions and how to move forward on Articles 6 and 7 and on other issues. We'll have perspectives from experts from affected communities and also other policy experts, including a spot for ICAN's policy recommendations to states parties at the end for this 2 MSPs. So hope we have some delegates here to hear that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kelly to introduce our first speaker. And thanks again everyone for coming here and to our speakers for speaking especially.
Thank you. Again, my name is Kelly Lundeen. I work with Nukewatch and Affected Communities and Allies Working Group in the United States on territory of the Anishinaabe Ojibwe, otherwise known as Wisconsin. We will now hear from Tina Cordova. Tina was born and raised in the small town of Tularosa in New Mexico. In 2005, Tina co-founded Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, whose mission is to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the unknowing, unwilling, uncompensated innocent victims of the first nuclear blast on Earth that took place at the Trinity site in south central New Mexico. She has advocated for the expansion of the United States legislation, RECA, Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, to bring needed support and compensation to her community and others. Tina herself is a cancer survivor, having been diagnosed with thyroid cancer when she was 39 years old. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start out by thanking the ladies who invited me to be here today to share with you the story of the first people ever exposed to radiation any place in the world, the Downwinders of New Mexico. Kelly, Elizabeth, Marty, Alicia, thank you so much for including me in this panel discussion. I also want to thank Linda, who made sure that I was able to come to New York to be here with everybody today. And I want to recognize that there are other people here in the room with me from New Mexico, Jake Hoagland from Nukewatch, New Mexico, and Mary Lane from Santa Fe, who's a big supporter of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. Thank you for being here. Sebastian, raise your hand. Without Sebastian's work, recent work on fallout mapping, the government would be able to continue to perpetuate a lie that the fallout from Trinity went off in a northeasterly direction from the Trinity site and never affected most of the state of New Mexico. And so, Sebastian, we commend you for your diligent work to bring truth to the scenario that took place in New Mexico. I want to talk today just briefly about the Trinity test itself and what made it so unique in comparison to other tests. Then I'll talk about our lifestyles that led to our overexposure to radiation. I'll talk about the results of being overexposed to radiation for my own family and the other families that we've documented. I'll talk about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and where we're at real time with that and the shortcomings with the program. And then I'll close with a call to action. So the Trinity test was the only time our government ever tested a device on a platform 100 feet off the ground. What literally took place is that with the force of the bomb, it came down, it intercepted the earth, it took up an enormous amount of sand, dirt, animal and plant life, incinerated it because it created 10,000 times the heat of the sun. And then it created a fireball that exceeded the atmosphere, penetrated the stratosphere, traveled 40 to 80,000 feet high by estimation. Once it reached the stratosphere, it sent radioactive fallout all over the world. But in the immediate vicinity of Trinity, for days afterwards, an ash fell from the sky. It was also very inefficient. The bomb had to detonate that morning, and so they overpacked it with plutonium. They put 13 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium in that bomb, and only 3 pounds were necessary for the fission process, which means a full 10 pounds of plutonium with a half-life of 24,000 years went up in that fireball and dispersed the radioactive particle of plutonium all over what's called the Tularosa Basin as part of the ash that fell from the sky. What the scientists learned at Trinity is that to create mass destruction, they would have to detonate the bombs much higher in the atmosphere in Japan. And so those bombs were detonated at 1,600 and 1,800 feet. Those bombs were very destructive and produced far less fallout than Trinity. Our lifestyles, we were people that were very dependent on the land at the time. We didn't have running water, which means we collected the rainwater that fell from the sky and fell onto our rooftops, and we diverted it into cisterns or holding tanks or holding ponds. That water was what sustained our lives. It was our rainy season. July is our rainy season. If you know about the history of Trinity, they actually waited for a break in the rain that day to test the bomb at 5:30 in the morning. It had rained heavily before and it rained heavily afterwards. So as that ash fell from the sky and got on top of everything, it became part of our water supply. We have massive irrigation ditch systems in all these little towns that are still active today. The town I grew up in, 45 miles from the Trinity test site, has the largest open ditch system in all of New Mexico. So our water was completely contaminated. We had no electricity in most of the villages surrounding Trinity. That means we had no grocery stores. You could go to a mercantile store and you bought things like flour, sugar, coffee, rice, cereal, but you bought no dairy, you bought no produce, you bought no meat. All of those things were produced by us at our homes, which means as the ash fell from the sky and became part of our environment, we now had our complete food supply affected. I think most of you know there's 3 methods of being exposed to radiation. There's inhalation, and as the ash fell from the sky, we inhaled it. And then there's ingestion, which I've just described as I've described the way that we fed ourselves and how we accessed water. But there's also absorption through your skin. And I always tell people a lot of times that is forgotten. When you don't have running water, you don't bathe as often. And so once the radiation became part of your skin, on your scalp or on your skin, it's likely it stayed there for many days before you were able to wash it away. So we were horribly overexposed to radiation as a result of our lifestyles. We lived as close as 12 miles to the test site, and we know because we've done we've collected the data, that based on 1940 census, in a 50-mile radius, there were 13,000 children, women, and men living adjacent to Trinity. And if you extend that boundary to 150 miles, there were 500,000 people living there. The government has always described the area as remote and uninhabited. No one lived here, no one was harmed. Nothing could be further from the truth. We lived there. We have lived there forever. They discovered footprints at White Sands National Monument, which is literally part of the White Sands Missile Range. And those footprints date back 23,000 years. So for them to say no one lived here and no one was harmed is a complete and absolute lie. When they open the site twice a year to visitors, they continue to say that to everybody. No one lived here, no one was harmed. So what are the results of overexposure to radiation? I am the 4th generation in my family to have cancer since 1945. I had 2 great-grandfathers alive at the time living in Tularosa. Within 10 years, they both had what was called stomach cancer. This developed in 1955 at a time when we had never heard the word cancer in our communities. People didn't know what that meant, and we'll never know exactly what happened with my great-grandfathers because we had no medical facilities, no place for them to receive treatment. They were given morphine, they were sent home to die, and it was a horrible death. Both my grandmothers had cancer. My father had 3 cancers that he didn't have risk factors for. My father first developed cancer at the base of his tongue. They had to remove part of his tongue. And then he had to go through massive radiation treatments to make sure that nothing was left behind. My dad was very young when he was first diagnosed, and his only risk factor for oral cancer was that he was a 4-year-old child living in a downwind community at the time of Trinity. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't use chewing tobacco, had no viruses. A few years after that cancer, he developed prostate cancer, which was a walk in the park. And then 10 years after the first oral cancer, he developed a second primary lesion, which when I asked the doctors how could this be, they said, we don't know, but it happens all the time in New Mexico. And so I often say, my dad had cancer very similar to what Robert Oppenheimer had, but my father was not a chain smoker and he never drank a martini. Now I have a 23-year-old niece. She's the 5th generation in my family to have cancer since 1945. Mackenzie is 23 years old. She was diagnosed with thyroid cancer the same way I was, except I was 39, and I haven't had the heart to tell her what lies ahead for her. It has disrupted her life. And I wish I could say that this is over for us. It is not. This is multi-generational, and if you are exposed to radiation, there is a latency period before you develop and manifest as disease. If you are a child that is born into a family with genetics, there's no latency period. There's 2 families very close to me back home. One has a 2-year-old grandchild who just had one of her eyes removed because she has eye cancer, and her other eye is at risk. And I have another family from the Mescalero Reservation. They have an 11-month-old baby who's been on chemo since he was 2 months old. They have to take him to Houston for that treatment because there's not treatment for him in New Mexico. We have to hold bake sales and yard sales and car washes and enchilada dinners to raise the money to make sure that these children have what they need for care. Our government has looked away from us for 78 years. They've never acknowledged our sacrifice and our suffering. They never told us beforehand or afterwards. They've never come back to do an epidemiological study. They've never acknowledged any part of how they invaded our lands and our lives and destroyed our environment and left. And so 33 years ago, in 1990, there was a fund set up, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. We have never been included, although we were the first people exposed to radiation. We know that there are obvious shortcomings with that program. We're fighting right now, and it's under consideration right now in Congress, as we speak, to add those states that have been left out of RECA along with the post-71 uranium miners. We're talking about states like Montana, Idaho, New Mexico, and adding states like Colorado and Guam for the first time, and then adding all of Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. And so we need everybody to come together with us because we have been so affected, not just physically and not just mentally, not just that way. We live with that all the time, but financially. New Mexico is the state most dependent on Medicaid any place in the country. 47% of the people in New Mexico access health care using Medicaid. And just recently, the statistics were released. There's about 2 million people living in New Mexico. We're carrying $881 million in medical debt, almost $1 billion. These are all manifestations of the fact that we are a sick population, made sick by, number 1, the uranium mining that Petuuche will talk about, and number 2, the development testing of nuclear devices. I want to mention very quickly, there's a documentary that has been produced about us, and if you're interested, please see Mary. She has some postcards about it. That documentary is making its way through film festivals and will be on a streaming platform soon. But it tells the whole history because when they produced Oppenheimer and they came to our state and they took advantage of our tax incentives, they completely left us out of the history. They looked away from us just like they did in 1945 when they came to New Mexico to establish the Manhattan Project. Let me just say that without the people of New Mexico, there would have been no Manhattan Project. We're the ones that built the roads, the bridges, the facilities, and then cleaned them. We're the ones that lost our lives in explosive accidents. The women were bussed up to Los Alamos. We're the ones that cooked the meals, cleaned the houses, fed the babies, and there's no acknowledgement of that in the Oppenheimer movie. This documentary tells the rest of the story. So where are we today? Please join with us. See us as we've never been seen before. Join with us today. Reach out to Senator McConnell and Speaker Johnson because right now they're the obstacle to us receiving the long sought and long fought for justice. Please reach out to them as soon as possible. I'm telling you it's under consideration right now. The most amazing thing happened yesterday. Senator Hawley from Missouri sent out a press release saying, if they don't keep RICA in the NDAA, I will not vote for it and I will do everything I can to block it. That is action that we could have never expected. We also have already gotten clearance from Representative Jim Jordan. We now need Senator McConnell and Senator Johnson to realize that they need to do the right thing by the people who've been harmed in this country and who've been looked away for so long. And this is a bipartisan issue. It's a nonpartisan issue, right? I always say exposure to radiation is not discerning. It affects the young, the old, the black, the white, the male, the female, the Democrat and the Republican alike. And if you take a look at the states we're trying to add, they're primarily Republican. And so with that, I will end and just say, please join with us. Reach out to Senator McConnell's office. It's easy to do if you go to his website, and also Speaker Johnson. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina, for sharing the story of your family, your community, and the resistance you have built in the United States. Thank you for giving us hope and for giving us action ideas. There are so many that have healthcare needs that need to be addressed, and there's so many more that can be helped by your grassroots advocacy. Next, we'll hear from Petuuche Gilbert. Petuuche is from Acoma, Pueblo in New Mexico, United States. He retired from the Acoma tribal government after 30 years. Petuuche worked with many others over 20 years for a UN declaration. He's president of the Indigenous World Association, a UN NGO that works with Laguna Acoma, and he works with the Laguna Acoma Coalition for a Safe Environment. Welcome, Petuuche.
Thank you, Tina, for this story of how really the first atomic weaponry affected your community and still affects the people there. Because this what has impacted us there in New Mexico. And yes, I will concentrate on uranium because that is really the development of the nuclear fuel that goes into the nuclear power plants, the weapons especially. I remember one of my colleagues who has since passed away also from cancer. And her husband also passed away from cancer because her husband worked at San Diego National Laboratory. And Carletta Garcia, her mother was very famous really in protest to nuclearism and traveled widely to talk about nuclear and uranium production on their land at Laguna. At one time she said some Japanese had come to visit us, and she apologized to the Japanese that were there for the bombing that took place in their land. Saying that, I apologize that the uranium that came from our homeland, bombed your people. Even though, actually, they had the uranium for developing the Manhattan bomb. Really didn't come from New Mexico at that time. But the importance is that the uranium that goes into the nuclear fuel production, is the essential element that begins all of this destruction. And somehow we have to address that because it's missing in this picture and discussion on the tree of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Somehow it's neglected that, how do you produce the weapons or how do you produce the nuclear energy? It has to come from someplace, and it really starts with its extraction from the ground. And the other thing I always emphasize in discussing the development of the nuclear energy is that and it was hard to really understand when I first heard that 70% of the world's global uranium production comes from indigenous lands. And I said, who came up with that? Is there a research that cites that? Yeah. But, it is true that, well, all of North America, yes, was indigenous people's land. And today there are 13,000 or more abandoned uranium mines in the United States. Most of these are in the West. And the Bureau of Reclamation is the one that puts this figure together, 13,000. An abandoned uranium mine is essentially a mine that no one now knows the legal ownership of that property where the uranium was mined. So the United States classifies them, well, they're really abandoned. So that means someone else has to now try to keep track of them and hopefully eventually try to remediate those places. In New Mexico, I say that there are at least 500 abandoned uranium mines. Most of these, and they're nicknamed or shortened to be AUMs. Most of these exist are on the Navajo Nation land. The Navajo Nation land, of course, is large. It extends into Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. But in where I live, which is an area has become identified as the Grants Mining District, and sometimes we'll use the word the Grants Uranium District. There were 190 abandoned uranium mines that EPA, then covers in their 5-year plan, and 5 uranium mills. In order to then take that uranium ore, you have to then process it to develop the yellow cake, and so the 5 uranium mills that of course are closed now. But what's left behind are mill tailings that cover many acres. The one that we really closely follow is a uranium mill tailing site of Anaconda Mining Corporation. I once worked there where yellow cake was produced. That's where I worked in the location of that mill tailings plant. 2 miles to the east of the Anaconda site is Homestake Barrett Gold that still attempts to remediate that site. And both Homestake and Anaconda are less than, I would say, 5 miles away from a community called Milan. Milan is next to Grants. Grants at one time called itself the uranium capital of the world. And they were proud of that. And they still want to capitalize on that and do new mining. But anyway, the other large mill that's also there that supposedly has the world's largest uranium mill tailings, they say it's at least 6 square miles. I don't know if that's a fact or figure, but that is the Kerr-McGee site. So these mining companies, or like I really should emphasize Jack Pile. Jack Pile mine was once the world's largest open pit uranium mine. That occurs on our sister Pueblo on the east side of my tribe's land. It's called Jack Pile. It was mined by the Anaconda, the mining company, and then they transported that by railroad to the Anaconda mill site. So that's that today that the United States likes to say that it was remediated, that EPA and others, cleaned up the mine site, but it has become a Superfund site because it's still radioactive. The land and the surface disturbance there produces radioactivity. So when rain and snow runoff occurs, a lot of that is transported downstream. And to this day, it has been studied by the University of New Mexico. But let me also describe one University of New Mexico study that's ongoing now that really characterizes and describes what's happening at the Church Rock community site. That mine site and mill site was managed by the United Nuclear Corporation let's say 50s and 60s and 70s, maybe even into the 80s. And the Navajo people that lived there, and the mine site was less than a mile away from the community. Their hogans are within less than a quarter of a mile from the mill tailing site. So I've described it as a radioactive site, so that the people who live there and the children who are playing on the land are always working on this radioactive dirt. And of course the dust is blowing, dust is flying in the air. This summer, the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission went out there because, you know, the community has been protesting EPA's and NRC's plan to move the uranium mill tailings just down the road, a half a mile away, to an unlined uranium mill tailings site. Anyway, when the head of the nuclear regulatory guy was out there, and they knew and felt that radioactive dust, there was a big windstorm at that time. And of course, they were breathing into that. I'm sure that they really felt, well, we're getting some of this radioactive dust into our lungs. And even this year, again, the organization I work with, I'm part of the Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment, invited people from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is a Organization of American States entity, to come to the site that's affecting their community. And those people that were in the car did not want to get out of their vehicles because they felt that, well, this place is contaminated, we're going to breathe in some of this radioactive air. But, you know, the people that were, the Navajos that were there with them said, we live here. You know, this is our home, this is our daily life here. And if you're just going to stay here for less than 30 minutes or less than an hour, so they convinced them to get out of their automobiles. But I think this is again where we try to point out that radioactivity that emits from these abandoned uranium mine sites or from the mill tailings is in the air. It affects the people's environment. It affects the people's health. And Tina mentioned the Radioactive Exposure Compensation Act. Many of our people have been compensated as a result of radioactivity. And you have to prove through medical health inspections and medical health records that you were affected by some form of radiation. And so, and yet they were able to then do that because they had contacted some kind of radiation poisoning from working in the mills or working in the mines. And it's just so many of our people in our home there are affected by cancer. One of my nieces today has cancer today. And it's, you know, we say this, well, where is this cancer coming from? And we don't know. There's been no really radioactive epidemiological type of health studies being performed. And it's good to see that the University of New Mexico is currently doing what they call a birth cohort studies at this church rock facility where the Redwater Pond Road community lives. And they're finding that radioactive elements are now in pregnant women and in their newborn babies. And you know, I was really kind of depressed when I saw Dr. Ian Ferrari's chart that said that if a child internalizes radioactive elements into their body, it's 50% likely in their lifetime that they will get cancer. Yeah, so it's a terrible disease, a terrible health situation that we have, yet really nothing is done by the state of New Mexico or by the Environmental Protection Agency that we look to deal with these health impacts. And so we just must, I think, pay more attention to the uranium. And this is why, again, I emphasize to the TPN states that as part of their implementation and work on it. Yeah, that they had to do this recognition of Article 6 and 7, and how do you then help or get the nation state to pay attention to the impacts of both atomic bomb testing that has occurred on indigenous people's lands, or the current radioactive elements that are left over from abandoned uranium mines, and of course the mill sites themselves too really need attention, and that's the challenge. And even today, I'll say this about the Homestead Barrago site. That company, Homestead Barrago, wants to walk away. After 40 years of trying to reclaim the area, it's unachievable. So they've told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we want alternative contamination limits. They want to raise those limits up to where they think that they can meet those, but they're just saying now, you, the federal government, the public at large, must continue to maintain some kind of oversight to this, but the company itself, this billion-dollar company is going to walk away. And of course, we're protesting that. We're protesting that too. So what our motto of Multicultural Alliance is really keep uranium in the ground.
Thanks so much to our speakers so far for all your compelling and rich expertise and your activism on this. Our next speaker is Hinamoeura, who's a French Polynesian in her mid-30s, whose experience of her own leukemia and realization that it was a legacy of French nuclear testing in the Pacific led her to activism on this issue. She works to ensure that the stories and experiences of victims and their families won't be forgotten, and to pressure the French government into acknowledging responsibility and giving medical and financial support. And she was recently elected to the Polynesian Assembly of Representatives, and was recently seeing through an assembly vote supporting the TPNW, which we're very excited to hear about. Thanks, Hina.
I apologize in advance if at times I don't pronounce certain words correctly, because I used to speak French. But if I speak in French, I'm not sure that you will all be able to understand me. Thank you, Tina, for what you said. It really touched me. I held back from crying while listening to you. I really felt in my flesh everything you said. We come from different places, but we have today the same problems. And it's important for me to be with you as the third generation of survivors of the French test on our territory. For my family, it was first my grandma who had the thyroid cancer, my grandma, then my grandma, then my mom, then my auntie, who also had breast cancer. And so my sister and I, my big sister and I, we were monitored for thyroid level based on our family's history. And finally, it was my sister who was going to be affected. And I had nothing. It was when we were teenagers. So I really felt lucky until I was 24 years old, when I was diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia. I've had leukemia since 10 years today, still not cured, and condemned to take treatment to put the disease to rest. This is what will push me to become an activist, and I was also motivated by friends' non-action, friends not fully recognizing our prejudice. I'm very grateful to have been able to attend the first meeting last year in Vienna and have met the communities affected. It really helped me answer all the questions I've been asking myself, such as whether our illnesses are linked to the nuclear bomb. Because in Polynesia, we're all asking ourselves this question: or we don't know the consequences of these 193 bombs. So much so that the propaganda was so strong on our people. And as colonized people, we have always felt inferior. If friends tell us that the nuclear is clean, so it's true. It is difficult to be an anti-nuclear activist in my country because we have to decolonize our memories and our minds first. We also must overcome the trauma of nuclear power and our colonial history, which is still present in our elders today. They still have fear to speak. And we can also see that in the current generation. Our ignorance is their power, the power of all the states that have used the nuclear bomb. And I'm so grateful to have met other people who have been victims of nuclear bombs. It really makes me realize the truth of the impact today. We are communities in the four corners of the world with the same heavy history as a people and a territory that has hosted nuclear tests, and today we have the same heavy consequences. Today in my country, we don't have medical support commensurate with the damage suffered, and we are also 20 years behind in cancer treatment, and we don't have the financial resources to care for the people. Sorry, I'm being emotional because there are so much people that will die because our hospital can't care, is the word, care them? Some of them, mostly the kids with leukemia, they go to France, but it's really difficult for us. We're not used to winter. Imagine we're on an island and we have to go to a country, another country, 20 hours of flight, some for years. Imagine the family, the mother and the father. That's our story, history, our story today. And I want to say you're lucky when you go to France, because my country has enough money to make you be care in France. Because for some, they're going to stay in Tahiti and they will just die. It is why, Articles 6 and 7 are so important. We need assistance. And since mostly in Tahiti, in 1977, France has given us the health competence. It was 10 days after the first nuclear bomb. And they let people believe that it is to give us more autonomy. So my politics at this time, they were happy. Oh, thank you, you give us the competence of the health competence. When in fact, it condemns us to bear the cost of all radiation-induced disease. And today, it's the big problem. We cannot properly care for our people. And also, I hope that with this work that we are making, we will be able to respond to the question, for how long will we be sick? Will our children be sick? I speak here as also a mom of 2 boys that are healthy, but I'm also scared about them, and I'm so thankful to being a mom. It's the greatest thing in my life. It's pushing me a lot for the struggle to continue, because I'm thinking about them, about the next generation. And it's very sad because also in Tahiti there's some people that decided not to have kids because they don't want to finish like in France in a hospital with a kid with leukemia. And I feel so sad for the woman or the man, because being a mom, it was so great. My kids, they give me so much power. It gives me sense to my life. And it's why I'm very happy to work with you. And I hope that we will be able soon to apply the Article 6 and 7. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inoue. I don't think there's a dry eye, but thank you for everything you shared. It's really, really important and powerful, and for all your work and activism as well. So our next speaker is Mary Tuilau, who's from Fiji, and she's been recently doing work with the Fijian test veterans there, and is here to represent them and to share about the work that they've been doing together. So, Mary, please.
On behalf of our Fiji Christmas Island Veterans Association and Fiji Returned Soldiers and Ex-Servicemen Association, Bula Vinata, Menomini Chikon Nambula, Bula Sautu. We bring warm greetings and may we wish you good life and may life be ours collectively abundant, in abundance. To give more context on Fiji history, though we were one of the Pacific's test sites, our forefathers served the military and navy that were deployed to Christmas Island and Lundeen Island, where the thermonuclear and hydrogen bomb were detonated. From 1957 to 1958, Fiji was under British colonial rule by then, and there was a call for military recruitment. The veterans were ranging from ages 15, 16, 17, 20, and 21, fresh out of high school. As a nation that is full of life, just like how we greeted us this afternoon, it means life, and our veterans were full of it. They came with life and also the life skills that they taught the colleagues that they work amongst, which was the British veterans as well. They were veterans who were deployed to Christmas Island without the proper consultation of why they were going to Christmas Island or Lundeen Island. And as soon as they reached Christmas Island, they were told about this nuclear testing. These were kids that do not, the Pacific, we do not have the life of mass destruction. It isn't our lifestyle. And let alone, it is not in our thought or in our curriculum to talk about this or have the education on nuclear testing or nuclear waste. As the veterans reached Lundeen Island and Christmas Island, the scientists started to tell them, slowly started to tell them about nuclear. While educating them, the veterans started to consult within each other and also the authorities that represent Fiji if they could go back home. But then they were advised, given they were under the British colonial rule, they were advised that they were going to take on the task, as that was within their policy in the military and navy. There were more than 400 veterans that left our shores and were specifically assigned for preparation, cleanup, and used as guinea pigs, and were compensated unjustly. They would build houses for £1, or they would build roads for £1. And within all the atrocity that happened within this time frame, our veterans suffered, as our community had shared earlier on, leukemia, hemophilia, thyroid cancer, to name a few. Our veterans have, for decades, have sought for compensation, sought for medical assistance. Our veterans, they leave this place as we speak, struggling for medical assistance. We do not have the medical assistance that comes with the radiation that was conducted unjustly towards them. Some of the positive obligations that they were hoping to get from Article 6 and 7 is for Britain to bring themselves into the table. We've been requesting them to have this conversation for decades, and they have not been releasing our medical reports that outlines the level of radiation that affects us. Part of the ask from the Article 6 on victim assistance is to have genetic consultation and research to properly report on their level of medical issues that they're going through. Have local doctors from Fiji go abroad and get the proper education on radiation so that we can look after ourselves during these times. Also, to have hospital development, construct a specialized hospital dedicated to addressing the health needs of nuclear testing veterans, equip the hospital with advanced medical technology, and facilitate required for the diagnosis and treatment of radioactive related illnesses. These are the few of the requests that our veterans have come up with, and given that there are quite a lot of our veterans that have passed on, we have their families who are still carrying the genetic struggles from the radiation. I've been struggling to share today. I guess our community has really shared a lot that stringing together words right now has really been a struggle. And I guess through the tears and the sharing, we really hope that you'll see the veterans through it. If there's any question or anything that you'd like for me to further, I'm open to that.
Thank you so much, Mary. Nina, we're so grateful to have all of you here. Those of you who have been directly impacted, unafraid to tell your story, to have learned your story in the first place, even through all of the false narratives that you've been told and that your ancestors have been told. We need to hear, the world needs to hear the voices of those who know the truth about nuclear violence, because it is your lived experience. These are the people that need to be heard. As you can see all around the world, harms caused by nuclear imperialism start when the uranium is taken from the earth. Here in the United States, Nukewatch, this Nukewatch, we report on the entire range of nuclear survivors that come from every type of nuclear impacted community, including uranium mining and milling, production, processing, reprocessing facilities where workers, downwinders are exposed, including civilian nuclear power reactors, testing sites, radioactive waste storage sites. Around nuclear power facilities, for example, children are the ones who suffer the most from ionizing radiation. They are about 1.5 times more likely to be born with embryonal cancer. Born. with cancer and have over double the likelihood of childhood leukemia. And that doesn't include the accidents. Ionizing radiation from any source leaves generations of harm in its wake, and it's the same story wherever the atom has been unleashed on the population and on the earth. The most important thing we can do is abolish all sorts and sources of radioactive violence. The nuclear powers will not willingly make this choice to save humanity. They are beholden to their nuclear industry donors and their addiction to power. But those on the front lines are here to help the world understand what is needed to achieve nuclear justice. Now I'd like to introduce Mari Inoue, Esquire. Mari was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan. While working as an immigration attorney in New York since 2001, she has been active in grassroots movements to educate policymakers and elected officials of the costs, risks, and humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. As a co-founding member of Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World and an active member of Affected Communities and Allies Working Group, she advocates for nuclear-free policies that protect the most vulnerable members of society. Welcome, Mari.
Thank you very much. My name is Mari Inoue. I'm originally from Tokyo. My husband is from Nagasaki City. And I have been volunteering my time on nuclear issues since March 2011, which is when the ongoing nuclear disaster in Japan started. And one of my first policy recommendations that I co-authored in 2011 played a role in adopting stricter food safety standards in Japan. And calling for strict radiation protection standards is essential in protecting people from unnecessary radiation exposure. Since then, I have been collaborating with members of affected communities, diverse affected communities here in the US as well as in Japan and beyond, to promote human rights-centered policies to protect vulnerable members of society from ongoing nuclear colonialism. Nuclear issues are complex, extremely complex. We cannot fully discuss the human health impacts and environmental harm caused by nuclear weapons activities without understanding how the nuclear industry continues to oppress indigenous peoples and marginalized communities and suppress their voices as if they were expendable. We also need to recognize that the impacts of radiation exposure have been downplayed by nuclear armed states and their allies since the beginning of the nuclear age. The US military denied the impacts of residual radiation exposure soon after the bombings. The US also imposed press code on atomic bombing when they occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952. The famous lifespan study on Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bomb survivors does not consider impacts of internal radiation exposure, such as radiation inhaled from air or ingested from food or water into the body. So this is why it is so inspiring to hear stories of members of affected communities across the globe courageously speaking truth to the power and demanding justice. And they are hibakusha, they are hibaku nisei or second generation hibakusha, they are hibaku taikensha in Nagasaki, and they are many others who are still fighting to be recognized as hibakusha, and also victims of nuclear testing, the victims of nuclear programs, including uranium activities. And in 2021, more than 75 years after the atomic bombing, the Hiroshima High Court ruled in favor of the 84 black rain victims in Hiroshima, where the judge noted in their 300-page long decision that, quote, it is sufficient to prove that the possibility of damage to their health due to atomic bomb radiation cannot be ruled out, unquote. And I strongly hope that this interpretation will be applied widely to include similar victims, such as not just in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also globally, who are still fighting to be recognized as nuclear victims. And here in the US, even if the nuclear weapon is not used or tested, the development and production of nuclear weapons and storage of radioactive waste continue to harm people's health and contaminate soil, water, food with radioactivity. And based on the past and present lessons learned from nuclear issues, Affected Communities and Allies Working Group and Manhattan Project for Nuclear Free World submitted 2 working papers to second MSP, and these are NGO working papers 1 and 4. And I'd like to share some of the key recommendations. It is essential for state parties and all relevant parties to prioritize the needs and best interests of the most vulnerable members of affected communities over the needs and interests of state parties. Relevant parties include NGOs, religious leaders, parliamentarians, policymakers, academics, and scientific advisory group. And special efforts should be made to translate reports of affected states in common languages of those most impacted by nuclear weapons and radioactive violence, and not just the official languages of the UN, in accordance with the principles of accessibility, inclusivity, non-discrimination, transparency, in coordination with affected communities as outlined in Vienna Action 25. And there's no safe dose of ionizing radiation. All exposures are cumulative, and some isotopes are extremely long-lived. Recognize the legitimacy of the lived experience of individuals and communities exposed to radioactivity and incorporate findings into the literature and state policies. All affected communities impacted by the nuclear activities of nuclear armed states deserve equitable attention from the international community. Define victim under Article 6 as broadly as possible. Consider including those impacted by the development, production, and storage of nuclear weapons and radioactive waste from nuclear programs, including those from uranium mining and related activities. Also consider including second and third generation victims if one of their parents is recognized as a nuclear victim under their national law. Guarantee access to health services and treatments for the future generations of victims. And informed consent is not complete without providing the necessary knowledge, tools, and notice and common rulemaking that will allow members of affected communities and relevant districts to comprehend the nature and extent of the risks associated with national and local measures, radiation protection standards, radioactive waste policies, and other related issues. Systemic racism and nuclear colonialism continue to disproportionately impact indigenous peoples, communities of color, and other members of marginalized communities. And the TPNW recognizes the disproportionate impact on nuclear weapon activities on indigenous peoples. Therefore, it is essential to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, which are internationally recognized under the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And self-determined development, respect for indigenous peoples' knowledge, culture, and traditional practices that contribute to sustainable and equitable development, and free, prior, and informed consent should be respected. And approximately, Petuuche mentioned this earlier, but 70% of the world's uranium production occurs on lands inhabited by indigenous peoples. And uranium mining, the essential first step in the production of every nuclear bomb, has taken a terrible toll on indigenous communities in many parts of the world. And abundant uranium mines, uranium tailing, and other nuclear waste from uranium-related activities contaminate indigenous lands, water, and food, and cause devastating environmental and health impacts. And in some countries, indigenous lands are under ongoing pressure to be the solution to the world nuclear waste problem. And the acquisition of nuclear weapon usable material such as the uranium is the first step in making nuclear weapons, and protection afforded to uranium enterprise run counter to the goals of the TPNW. To protect the health and lands of indigenous peoples and to eliminate nuclear weapons, we need strong commitments to adopt policies against uranium mining and exporting uranium for nuclear arms states. And we strongly disagree with the language in the preamble of TPNW that upholds nuclear energy, because upholding nuclear energy creates more victims and affected communities, and will prevent us from effectively achieving humanitarian goals under Article 6 and fundamental goal of the treaty, the total elimination of nuclear weapons. The risk of nuclear proliferation posed by irradiated fuel is profound. Each metric ton of spent fuel typically contains more than one Nagasaki bomb equivalent of plutonium. And as of 2023, some 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel had already been created in the United States by the commercial nuclear reactors. Spent fuel storage and disposal further pose a risk of sabotage and theft. We also need to recognize that nuclear energy and nuclear reactors are not peaceful because they were invented and developed to produce plutonium to build nuclear weapons that killed and destroy the health of so many. The full working paper is on the website of UNODI. These are working paper 1 and 4. And I would like to briefly report that US groups delivered no-nuke certificate and open letter to both US mission and Russia mission. The open letter was endorsed by the about 40 US groups, urging those two countries to join TPNW and work towards elimination of nuclear weapons. And we highlighted the importance of diplomacy and dialogue. And we will continue, as a US group, we will continue to demand US government to join the TPNW and eliminate all nuclear weapons. So thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone for your contributions so far, and as Kelly said, also for your courage and sharing and for all your work. And thanks, Mari, for also sharing your recommendations to two states parties. Finally, I want to hand over to Alicia Sanders-Zakre, who's ICAN's Policy and Research Coordinator, to give some more, well, I suppose, immediate priorities and recommendations to the two MSP, two states parties, as work gets going on this area of Article 6 and 7. I guess, we have a long way to go to make the impact that we want to see, for affected communities, for a practical impact, to be developing more positive approaches in addressing nuclear harm, and also to be putting the pressure on, as Hina was saying, to bring others to the table who aren't in the treaty, but we feel that the treaty can help us do this, and we've seen this with other frameworks. Even if states aren't joining, they can be influenced by what's going on in it. So states parties need to work very hard to get there, and in collaboration with their partners, which I think should include all of us in this room. So without further ado from me, Alicia, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and my deepest thanks to the panelists who spoke before me. I know you've all traveled a long way to come here, and your remarks make it clear why this work is so urgent. I'll speak specifically about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and how it seeks to address nuclear harm, including through the reference to the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons activities on Indigenous peoples in the preamble, as well as Articles 6 and 7, which I know we've referenced a lot. But these are the articles of the treaty that create the first international framework to provide victim assistance and environmental remediation, situated in a framework of international cooperation amongst all states parties. So, broadly, states' goals for implementing these articles should be to increase and improve assistance to survivors and affected communities according to their priorities and the rights-based approach of the TPNW. Unfortunately, we know how much current national efforts are falling short, and this international framework can provide impetus for improvements on the national level, as well as a framework for international assistance for governments that require that form of assistance. In addition, implementation of these articles can increase attention and knowledge about the ongoing impacts of nuclear weapons around the world, through events like these, discussions that we heard in the UN plenary this morning, and more. So ICAN has been convening regular discussions over the past year and a half, and before then. But since the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW, to discuss these articles and what we want to ask states parties for. Many of you have been involved in those conversations. If you haven't and you want to, you can just get in touch with me. And based on that, we've put together recommendations for what we want to see from states this week. These articles of the treaty are going to be discussed on Thursday morning in the particular segment of the treaty that's dedicated to Articles 6 and 7. And so in this segment of the meeting, we want to see states report on their progress. There are national reports from several of the states that identify as being affected states parties, including Kazakhstan, Kiribati, and New Zealand and Fiji, which both have veteran populations that were affected by nuclear testing. So they should present their national reports in this meeting about the assessment of harm in their countries from nuclear weapons, as well as their plans to address that harm. During this segment, we also hope that states will celebrate the progress. Speaking up during this segment to welcome the fact that there was a working group that was convened that's seriously discussed how to take forward implementation of these articles, the national implementation work that has happened in putting together initial assessments in beginning to consult affected communities within these populations, and to develop these national plans that now need to be taken forward. And really crucially, also at this meeting, it's essential that states parties adopt decisions to take forward this work. So at the last meeting, we had the Vienna Action Plan adopted that had roughly a dozen, I think 14 actions about how to implement assistance and environmental remediation. And now we need some decisions to take us into the next phase of work. This is really important, and these decisions have been discussed amongst states parties as well as amongst civil society, who've been able to attend these meetings and have even had direct consultations with states parties about them. So in terms of the decisions that we'd like to see adopted, first of all, it's important to renew the mandate of the working group. So this is the group of states parties that have been meeting to discuss how to take forward implementation of victim assistance and environmental remediation, led by Kazakhstan and Kiribati as affected states parties where nuclear weapons were tested. After affected states have submitted their initial reports of harm from nuclear weapons in their countries, those are just initial assessments and need to be built on. And so we'd like to see an agreement and a commitment to build on these initial assessments of harm, doing whatever additional research is needed to understand in a fuller scope the harm that's been caused in their countries, and begin to implement their national plans to take the first steps towards putting their commitments into action. There is also a format to provide reporting on what's happened. These are voluntary reporting guidelines, and these should be adopted by states parties and recommended for use. These kind of reporting guidelines may seem technical and bureaucratic, but it's important for civil society and for affected communities to be able to read about what's happening and to advocate for more work where needed and for close consultation and transparency. And finally, there should be further discussions on establishing an international trust fund to be able to fund this work. That's really at the key of the problem for many affected communities is the lack of funding available to provide the necessary assistance that's needed and to begin to clean up remediated environments. So this is really a crucial element that needs to move forward. And we hope to see this fund established by the third meeting of states parties. But in the meantime, there needs to be further discussions to make that happen. In terms of what we want to see after this meeting concludes on Friday, again, the trust fund is really crucial. States parties should be ambitious in really moving forward to establish this trust fund by the third meeting of states parties. And based on conversations that we've had within ICAN, with civil society, with affected communities, we have a specific paper on guidelines for what this fund should look like and how it should be established to be as effective as it can be. There should be specific milestones set for national implementation. So it's great that there are plans that are being presented, but there could be more specific agreements on what needs to happen and when in order to advance on national implementation of these articles. And finally, I think there's still more room to go in terms of promoting inclusivity. It's a UN meeting, and while we are impressed by the states parties, particularly Kazakhstan and Kiribati's commitment to including affected communities and civil society more broadly, there's always more work that needs to be done. And I think Mari's recommendations, for example, on translation, when meetings are held, there's really more work to go. And there should be substantive discussions on this in the next period and a program of work to make this happen. So in conclusion, we're still in the early stages of implementing these articles on Articles 6 and 7 on really recognizing the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous peoples within this treaty framework. But it's a good start, and I think we have the possibility and the tools to take it forward and to achieve tangible progress and results for affected communities.
So we have reached our question and answer portion. We have 15 minutes total. We don't want to make the next group wait for us. We had to wait to get in here. So who has questions? Go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, we have Inga, Kathleen. Go ahead, Inga.
Yeah, are there any indications about the trust fund, if it's realistic to get that under the third MSP?
Do you want me to address, or do you want to give a question?
Sure. Okay, Kathleen.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for this beautiful panel today. My name is Kathleen Sullivan. I'm with Youth Arts New York Hibakusha Stories and the Nuclear Truth Project. I'm here with Robert Cronquist, and we've also been involved with Mari on the Manhattan Project for the Nuclear Free World. Mari's work makes us so proud. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. And also tonight, yes, thank you. And tonight we're so excited that the Nuclear Free Futures Award is honoring Tina and Hina for the brilliant work that you all do. Benedict Kubua Madison was here in this room earlier, so what a special event that will be this evening. So your tears, Hina, speak so profoundly to everybody in this room, because it is the voices of affected communities and Indigenous peoples that bring us to the crux of what we're all here to do, which is to save our planet for future generations. And your suffering is so potent. And my question is, what is the best way that allies can support Indigenous peoples and affected community members? I think the highlighting that the Nuclear Free Futures Award does is an excellent way to bring your voices into the public. But what, in your opinion, of those on the panel, is the best way for us to support as allies and to be advocates? And I'd love to hear about that. And just very quickly, Petuuche, you said that you're with the Multicultural Alliance for
A safe environment.
a safe environment. Okay, I was writing that down then. But what are words that you would give us, those of us that want to be allies and advocates in this space? Thank you.
Any other questions right now? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ricardo Roxon, and I work for Peaceful, the Japan-based international NGO. And I myself was a third generation of Hiroshima Hibakusha. So my heart is with you all, and we live in the same story. So I've been thinking, it's kind of similar to Kathleen's questions, but how we can, I see that there's a gap between the government work on victim assistance and environmental remediation. Is really, like Alicia said, it's technical and bureaucratic when it comes to the reporting guidelines or anything that they lead. For example, the coordination meeting between the civil society, it's very kind of the governments to give such an opportunity for us to come and make give them questions and have an open, inclusive dialogue. However, I feel that we, coming from a civil society or the community members from affected by nuclear weapons or testing or use, we feel there's a gap between like the language or like it's the technicality of the language spoken. So we often feel even though we have a voice to deliver, it's difficult to kind of have a dialogue because the conversation is so technical. It's intimidating for people from the communities. So I've been thinking if there's any way that allies or the community members alike to fill a gap between the government's language and the community's language. And I think there is a chance for the civil society with a lot of experience bridging the gap to come in and support. And also that victim assistance, I think, I've been hearing how important it is to include the cultural and traditional impact. And that's, and then to measure these qualitative elements and then put that into assistance mechanism. I think it starts from measuring how to measure these damaged values, and that can only be that can only come from the people who lived it. So how do you think from people from the affected communities? How can we allies support the measurement, and how can we work together to get the data into a useful element for the government who's working on creating the mechanism? If what I'm saying makes sense, so I'm a little nervous. Yes, and I think one last thing is that I personally think it is extremely important and valuable to create the horizontal network among the affected communities, because some communities are still struggling to find a way to measure the damage that they're living, or they're just struggling to face their daily sufferings and then trying to find a way of healing themselves. But the other communities are a little bit steps ahead. They know how to talk to the politicians. They know how to bring their voices up to the political level, like high-level dialogue. So I think we can support each other in a sense. We can learn from each other. To do that, we need a foundation. We need a network. So I just want to put that into on the floor as a point to discuss. Just to summarize, my question is to you all: how can, echoing Kathleen's question, how can allies support to fill the gap between your language and your voices to be delivered and be used, materialized by these government leadership on the Article 6 and 7?
Is there one last question? Or?
Yeah.
it's a kind of a question in the proposal, you know, that other people also say that how we can check the opinions and the reports, including the future plan. So my proposal is, yeah, we should make a network of the victims and especially the indigenous people, and they can be one part like one state, you know, and they can sit in the among the delegates. Sorry, among the delegates, and that they should have right to speak out, right? One government or one organization. So that is my proposal. They should not be just the people who get assistance from our activists or from our other organizations, but they have their own right to be one the network to report themselves. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, my name is Katsumi Furitsu from Japan, and I'm a physician and have some more experience to take medical care of the survivors, and I have the long-term relation to the indigenous peoples. We are friends of them, so sorry that I'm not so good at speaking English, but.
Thank you for the questions. I just want to make sure all of our panelists have time to answer. So if we can just start with Alicia and everyone can go around. We have a few different issues to address. So, okay.
Yeah, I guess first about if it's possible to establish an international trust fund by the third meeting of states parties. I think it's definitely possible. I mean, there's been a lot of support for this idea, certainly by the co-chairs of the working group, but also by other states parties. And I think that's the ambition. I guess the kind of sticking point has been the exact parameters of the trust fund. And so that's what needs a bit further discussion between now and then. But I think we should certainly have that ambition. We can't afford to wait. This is urgent, as I think this panel has really aptly demonstrated. In terms of, I also just wanted to quickly address the point brought up by Rico, which I think is a really good point. Just to say that it's the issue of including those most affected by an international legal treaty in that treaty's negotiations is not unique to the TPNW. And there's been a lot of kind of work and thought into this in other processes. And I think one way to think about it is either there's kind of three adjustments that can be made to facilitate better inclusion. One, I think, is the least fortunate, the least preferred one is for the most affected individual to make adjustments to have to attend the meeting. Unfortunately, that happens all too often, whether it's people having to travel to a place where they don't live, or tune into a meeting that's in an inconvenient time zone for them, or speak in a language that's not theirs. The ones that I think we're pushing for and working on are either that the meeting itself adapts to better include that population, and we've pushed for things like having meetings in different irregular time zones, having multiple meetings, it's working on translation, that's a big one. And then kind of the other option is having a third-party assistance and having an NGO more familiar with that venue, kind of providing a bridge and supporting effective community inclusion. So I think there's many different ways to do this. Definitely we need to work on all avenues.
Go ahead, Tina.
I did a call to action when I spoke, and
Obviously, I do want to reflect on Article 6 and 7 and the fact that it would address our issues very well. And we were glad for being included in discussions around that, and grateful that it's given consideration. All of those things are very important because, you know, the history of this is that people have been dying and without assistance for so long, and we can't, it's not sustainable, first of all. And, you know, we're grateful for the consideration given inside the treaty to taking care of those people who've been marginalized forever. And I did the call to action about RICA. Obviously, it has huge shortcomings that could be addressed by the treaty. And we're just grateful for the support. We're grateful that we have these opportunities to speak about this in a broad group, and we're grateful for being able to work with other communities that have suffered. Obviously, it's very, very, what we have been through is shared in a way that we didn't get to recognize as often. And if maybe the only good thing that came out of COVID is that Zoom allowed us to now become linked in a way we never were before, and we're no longer siloed in our suffering. And so I think that's the best way that I can answer the questions that were asked.
Yeah, go ahead.
I totally agree with you, Rico, and what you said also. We have to build a network between us. I think sharing our story makes us realizing, for me, that we are sick because of that. And in Tahiti, we want to know how many diseases are caused by that, because today we have a compensation law that not really help us, and that recognize only few cancer, but we saw so many cancer. We have made many problems with our babies. I don't know how you say malformation. Like no hands, and me, I really want to work on that. How many diseases, so it will make us be aware to ask for reparation to France. It's one work that I want to do, and since France don't say anything to us, don't recognize the fact, I had to build that alone and with the activists in my country, and I build my knowledge by comparing our story. It's how I work today, but I think it's really, really important that we maybe make a foundation, or I don't know, about our community as a victim of nuclear bomb. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I know we have very limited time left, but just respond to Catherine Sullivan's. Well, one way obviously is getting Indigenous peoples here, or people that are affected, the financial support, and I'm glad that her organization helped me get here, is to spread the word around. But really it's education, that we're all radiation victims, the world at large. And that's what we're trying to emphasize in the statements that we're making, that we're all affected, that all we need to work together. I see many nuclear activism in many NGOs, and even in New Mexico. But unfortunately, we're not really working together. We're not collaborating, contacting, communicating with each other. Then that needs to be done. And I'm proud of our organization. It's called Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment. And I'm going to pass this around. People that are interested can learn a little about our organization, Multicultural. It's really the Indians and non-Indians, living and working together. And what we also did was we passed, our organization has a nuclear-free zone declaration. So I'm also going to pass these ones around too, that if you're interested in how, what we did and what we're seeing in it. So it's just really, I believe in this educating each other, everybody, and to getting the youth involved, and then all really to coming together like meetings like this.
Oh, yes. I was reading other policy papers by NGOs, and working paper 12 really struck me because they mentioned about the possibility of providing victim assistance under Article 6 for those communities impacted, but their states, their governments have not joined the TPNW. And I think that's really important issue to explore. Because as we see here, none of our governments have joined the TPNW, and how are we going to provide assistance? So that's something that it's a homework for me for the next, MSB. But I hope that you all will also think about this issue as well. Thank you.
Just to add on, carrying the burden of proof isn't easy. It's never easy. And coming from the context of our veterans, for Fiji obligation to the veterans, they receive about 150 to 200 a month with their medical issues, and together with trying to make a living for themselves and struggling to pay medical assistance. And when we say struggling with paying medical assistance, we're talking about going overseas for treatment. How is 150 to 200, reasonable for our veterans? They were given a one-off grant, and even in that one-off grant, straight after the Christmas Island and Nukewatch testing, that was to aid. That was to aid already what their family were going through, given they were paid a pound. What is a pound for? And this is why we have so much unresolved issues with Britain. We have great friends and families and alliances in Britain, but it is the responsible authorities that we're talking about. So when we're talking about victims' assistance, it's the bare minimum. These are human rights. We were treated unjustly. And if we're going to share a tear or two, that's us hoping that you'll see our veterans, our victims, our survivors through them. We shouldn't be begging for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll come to a close. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you especially to all of our panelists.
And we have to leave straight away because there's another event. So please take your conversation.